The Mediterranean Sea turned crimson in 256 BC, not from the setting sun, but from the blood of tens of thousands of men dying in the largest naval battle the ancient world had ever witnessed. 680 warships locked in a death struggle off the coast of Sicily, carrying nearly 300,000 soldiers and sailors into a maelstrom of fire, bronze, and breaking wood. And the storm that followed would drown over 100,000 more. This was the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, where Rome and Carthage hurled their entire naval might at each other in a contest that would determine the fate of the Western Mediterranean. The stakes could not have been higher. Rome planned an audacious invasion of Africa itself, striking at the heart of the Carthaginian Empire. Carthage assembled the largest fleet in its history to stop them. The clash would last for hours. Ships would splinter and sink. Men would drown by the thousands, dragged down by their armour into the dark depths. Entire squadrons would be surrounded and annihilated, and before the sun set on that terrible day, the sea would be choked with corpses and wreckage stretching as far as the eye could see. This is the story of Rome's greatest naval gamble and the horrifying human cost of ancient warfare. If you want to witness more epic battles from history unfold, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Wars in History. Drop a comment below telling us which ancient battle we should cover next. Now let's dive into one of the bloodiest days in naval history. The year was 256 BC, and the First Punic War had already raged for 8 brutal years. Rome and Carthage, the two superpowers of the Western Mediterranean, were locked in a struggle for dominance that had consumed Sicily in flames and bloodshed. What began as a minor dispute over the city of Messina had exploded into a devastating 23-year nightmare that would test both civilizations to their breaking point. Rome, a land power with virtually no naval tradition, faced Carthage, an ancient maritime empire whose ships had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. The Carthaginians were descendants of the Phoenicians, the greatest sailors the ancient world had known. Their navy was vast, their crews experienced, their admirals seasoned by generations of naval warfare. They controlled crucial trade routes, possessed colonies across North Africa, Spain, and the islands of the Mediterranean, and their wealth seemed limitless. But Rome was different. Rome was hungry. Rome was expanding. And Rome refused to accept defeat. The Romans had suffered humiliating losses at sea in the early years of the war. Their inexperience showed. Their ships were clumsy copies of captured Carthaginian vessels. Their sailors were farmers and soldiers who had never seen the ocean before being thrust onto heaving decks. Yet Rome possessed something Carthage lacked: an iron determination to learn, adapt and overcome any obstacle through sheer bloody-minded persistence. The Romans revolutionized naval warfare with a simple but devastating innovation called the corvus, or raven. This boarding bridge, approximately 11 meters long and just over a meter wide, could be dropped onto enemy ships with a heavy spike that punctured the deck and locked the vessels together. Suddenly, naval battles became land battles fought on wooden decks. The superior Roman infantry could pour across these bridges and overwhelm Carthaginian sailors in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The corvus turned Rome's greatest weakness into its greatest strength. By 256 BC, Rome had won enough naval victories to dare the unthinkable. The Roman Senate decided to take the war to Africa itself, to invade the Carthaginian homeland and force a decisive end to this grinding conflict. It was an audacious plan, perhaps even reckless. No foreign power had successfully invaded Carthaginian territory in living memory, but the Romans assembled a fleet of staggering proportions: 330 quinqueremes, massive warships each carrying approximately 300 rowers and 120 combat troops. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Each Roman quinquereme required highly coordinated rowing from 300 men, pulling in perfect rhythm to propel the massive vessel through the water. These soldiers aboard were equipped with swords, javelins, armour, and shields. Supplies had to be loaded for the journey and the subsequent land campaign. The logistical challenge of assembling, provisioning, and crewing such a fleet was unprecedented. Rome was committing virtually its entire naval strength to this single, desperate gamble. The fleet was commanded by both consuls for the year, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus, a sign of how seriously Rome took this enterprise. The plan was straightforward but breathtakingly ambitious: sail from Sicily to Africa, defeat or evade the Carthaginian navy, land the army and march on Carthage itself. If successful, the war could end in a single campaign season. If unsuccessful, Rome would lose not just the fleet, but potentially the war itself. The Carthaginians were not blind to Roman preparations. Spies and scouts brought word of the massive Roman build-up in Sicily. Carthage responded by assembling its own enormous fleet. 350 warships under the joint command of two experienced admirals, Hanno and Hamilcar. The Carthaginians intended to intercept the Roman fleet before it could reach Africa and destroy it utterly. They would rely on their superior seamanship, their faster and more maneuverable ships, and their centuries of naval expertise. The stage was set for the greatest naval confrontation the ancient world had ever seen. Two massive fleets, carrying nearly 300,000 men between them, were on a collision course off the southern coast of Sicily near a promontory called Cape Ecnomus. Neither side could afford to lose, neither side could back down, and neither side had any idea of the scale of slaughter that awaited them. The Roman fleet that set sail from Sicily in the summer of 256 BC was a floating city, a testament to Roman industrial capacity and organizational genius. 330 quinqueremes represented not just ships, but an entire economic and logistical system mobilized for war. Each vessel required timber for the hull, bronze for the rams, iron for weapons and fittings, rope for rigging, and leather for armour. The shipyards of Italy had worked overtime for months, perhaps years, to produce this armada. The crew of each Roman warship reflected the militaristic society that had built it. 300 rowers pulled the oars in cramped, stinking conditions below deck. These were free citizens, not slaves, men who had volunteered or been conscripted into service. The rowing required brutal physical effort, hour after hour, with calloused hands gripping the oars and backs straining in synchronized rhythm. Above them stood 120 soldiers, legionaries equipped with the standard Roman equipment of gladius sword, pilum javelin, rectangular shield, and armour. These were the men who would board enemy vessels and turn naval combat into the kind of brutal infantry combat where Rome excelled. The Roman formation as it sailed toward Africa was unique and carefully designed. The fleet was arranged in 4 squadrons forming a massive wedge shape. The first 2 squadrons, commanded personally by the 2 consuls, formed the point of the wedge, driving forward like a spearhead. Behind them came the 3rd squadron, and at the rear the 4th squadron protected the transport vessels carrying additional supplies, siege equipment, and cavalry horses. This formation was defensive, designed to protect the vulnerable transports while still presenting a unified front to any enemy attack. The Carthaginian fleet waiting off Cape Ecnomus was slightly larger, 350 warships crewed by approximately 140,000 men. These were professional sailors, many from Carthage itself, others from the maritime cities of Phoenicia, still others from Greek colonies and North African ports. The Carthaginian navy was not just a military force but the backbone of a commercial empire. These crews knew the Mediterranean intimately, every wind and current, every harbour and hidden danger. Carthaginian ships were sleeker and faster than their Roman counterparts. The Carthaginians had not adopted the corvus because they did not need to. Their strategy relied on superior manoeuvrability, ramming attacks, and the skill of their crews to outflank and overwhelm enemy vessels. Their admirals, Hanno and Hamilcar, were experienced commanders who had spent their careers at sea. They devised a cunning strategy to exploit Roman inexperience and the vulnerability of the lumbering transport ships. The Carthaginian battle plan was elegant in its simplicity. Hamilcar would command the centre of the fleet, engaging the leading Roman squadrons and then feigning a retreat, drawing the consuls forward and creating a gap between the Roman vanguard and the slower transports at the rear. Once this gap opened, the Carthaginian wings would surge forward and attack the vulnerable rear squadrons and transports from the sides, avoiding the deadly corvus boarding bridges which could only be deployed from the front of a ship. It was a trap, and the Carthaginians were confident the Romans would fall into it. The fleets sighted each other in the morning off Cape Ecnomus. The Roman wedge advanced steadily, the rhythmic splash of thousands of oars echoing across the water. On the deck, soldiers checked their weapons one final time. Below, rowers settled into the grueling pace that would be demanded of them. The Carthaginian line advanced to meet them, ships spreading out in a long formation designed to envelop the Roman flanks. The two Roman leading squadrons, commanded by consuls Regulus and Manlius, drove straight for the Carthaginian centre under Hamilcar. The corvus bridges were readied, the heavy spikes gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. As the fleets closed, the Carthaginian centre began to give ground, exactly as planned. The Roman consuls, eager for glory and convinced of their tactical superiority, pressed forward aggressively. The gap began to open between the Roman vanguard and the rear squadrons protecting the transports. Now the Carthaginian wings struck. The landward Carthaginian wing swept around and fell upon the third Roman squadron as it towed the transport ships closer to shore. These attacks came from the side, rendering the corvus difficult to deploy. The third squadron found itself fighting desperately against superior seamanship. Ships collided with sickening crashes of splintering wood. Marines hurled javelins across the narrow gaps between vessels. Men screamed and died. Simultaneously, Hanno commanded the seaward Carthaginian wing in a devastating attack on the fourth Roman squadron protecting the rear. These ships too found themselves surrounded, fighting for survival against more manoeuvrable Carthaginian vessels that darted in to ram and withdraw before the deadly boarding bridges could deploy. The Roman formation was fragmenting, breaking into separate battles scattered across miles of open water. The human cost was mounting with terrifying speed. When ships collided, the impact could crush men against railings or hurl them overboard. Ramming attacks drove bronze-sheathed prows through wooden hulls, flooding the lower decks where rowers sat trapped by the crush of panicking men trying to escape. Drowning was agonizing. Men weighted down by armour sank like stones, their last moments spent in dark water, lungs burning, limbs thrashing uselessly as the surface receded above them. Before we continue with the carnage, check out our exclusive Wars in History merchandise. Wear your passion for military history with pride. Link in the description below. Now back to the slaughter at Cape Ecnomus. The battle was fragmenting into 3 separate engagements, exactly as the Carthaginians had planned. but Hamilcar's centre was in serious trouble. The two Roman consuls commanding the finest squadrons of the fleet had not just pushed forward, but had decisively engaged the Carthaginian centre squadrons. The corvus proved devastating. Roman ships grappled Carthaginian vessels, the heavy spikes punched through decks with a sound like thunder, and legionaries poured across the boarding bridges. The fighting on the decks was savage beyond description. Roman legionaries were trained for this kind of combat, shield to shield, sword in hand, pushing forward in disciplined formation even as blood made the decks slippery, and corpses piled at their feet. Carthaginian marines, lighter armed and less trained in sustained infantry combat, gave ground. Ship after ship was boarded and captured. The Carthaginian crews killed or forced to surrender. The Carthaginian centre broke. Ships attempted to disengage and flee, but the corvus made disengagement almost impossible once grappled. The Roman consuls captured ship after ship. The Carthaginian crews either slaughtered in the boarding actions or taken prisoner. But even in this moment of triumph, the consuls could see that the rear of their formation was in desperate trouble. Smoke rose from burning ships, the sounds of battle carried across the water. The third and fourth squadrons were being pushed toward the shore, trapped against the Sicilian coast. Regulus and Manlius made the critical decision. They abandoned the pursuit of the fleeing Carthaginian centre and turned their squadrons back to rescue the trapped Roman ships. This was leadership of the highest order. The temptation to chase a beaten enemy and rack up more captures and kills must have been enormous, but the consuls understood that losing the transports and the rear squadrons would turn victory into catastrophic defeat. The Roman first and second squadrons, blooded but victorious, rode hard toward the rear of the battlefield. They found chaos. The Carthaginian wing had succeeded in pushing the third Roman squadron and the transports against the coastline. Ships were grounded on beaches, others were burning. The Carthaginians were attempting to board the trapped vessels from the seaward side, preventing escape. It was a slaughter, Romans dying by the hundreds on trapped ships that could not maneuver or flee. The arrival of the consuls' squadrons changed everything. Now it was the Carthaginians who were caught, trapped between the Roman third squadron fighting for survival and the fresh Roman first and second squadrons attacking from the open sea. The trap became a killing ground. Roman ships surrounded Carthaginian vessels and deployed the corvus from multiple angles. Boarding actions erupted across dozens of ships simultaneously. The Carthaginians fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed. The Carthaginian wing, trapped near the shore, was shattered. Dozens of ships were captured with their crews. A few managed to break free and escape along the shoreline, but the rest were taken or destroyed. The sea near the coast was thick with wreckage and bodies. The water itself seemed to boil with drowning men trying to reach the shore, weighted down by armour, crying out for help that would never come. The fourth Roman squadron, which had been engaged with Hanno's Carthaginian wing on the seaward side of the battlefield, was also in desperate straits. Without the corvus advantage, these Roman ships were being outmanoeuvred and slowly destroyed by superior Carthaginian seamanship. Ships were rammed, their hulls breached, water flooding in as rowers and soldiers scrambled topside only to face Carthaginian marines ready to kill anyone who emerged. But the fourth squadron had bought precious time through their stubborn resistance, and now the consuls' squadrons arrived. Regulus's ships, having just destroyed the Carthaginian landward wing, now fell upon Hanno's forces from an unexpected direction. The Carthaginians suddenly found themselves fighting on two fronts, the fourth Roman squadron in front of them and Regulus's victorious ships behind. This was too much. Without support from the rest of their fleet, which had either been destroyed or had fled, Hanno's squadron was hopelessly outnumbered. The Carthaginian ships attempted to disengage, to row away from the Roman trap, but many were too slow. The Corvus fell again and again. Roman marines boarded Carthaginian vessels, and the fighting was desperate, hand to hand, no quarter given or expected. The scale of killing on individual ships was horrific. Decks became charnel houses, men slipped in pools of blood. The wounded who fell were trampled by the fighting above them. Some ships burned, fire spreading rapidly through wooden hulls soaked in pitch and tar. Men leaped from burning vessels into the sea, preferring drowning to burning alive. The screaming could be heard for miles. By late afternoon, the Battle of Cape Ecnomus was over. The Romans had won a complete and devastating victory, but the cost in human lives was almost beyond comprehension. The Romans lost 24 ships sunk, which likely meant perhaps 10,000 men killed, drowned when their ships went down or killed in the savage boarding actions. These were Roman citizens, fathers and sons, who had marched to war believing in Rome's destiny, and now would never return home. The Carthaginian losses were catastrophic. More than 30 ships were sunk outright, their crews drowned or killed. Another 64 ships were captured with their crews, meaning thousands of Carthaginian sailors and marines taken prisoner, facing slavery or ransom. Ancient sources report that tens of thousands of Carthaginians were killed, drowned, or captured in the battle. The exact totals remain disputed by historians, but the human cost was staggering beyond measure. The aftermath of Cape Ecnomus was a scene from hell. The sea for miles around was choked with debris. Broken oars, pieces of hull, shields, weapons, and corpses floated on the gentle Mediterranean swell. Bodies of Romans and Carthaginians alike, indistinguishable in death, bobbed in the water. Many had drowned, their faces pale and bloated. Others bore terrible wounds, evidence of the savage fighting on the decks. The scale is difficult for modern minds to grasp. In a single day of fighting, tens of thousands of men were killed, drowned or captured out of the nearly 300,000 men who had entered the battle. Even conservative estimates suggest casualties in the tens of thousands, a scale of loss that rivals the worst single-day battles in human history. Consider the experience of a single ship's crew, 300 rowers below deck, packed together in the hot darkness, pulling their oars in rhythm while above them soldiers fought and died. If the ship was rammed, water would flood in quickly. The rowers trapped in the narrow rowing deck would have minutes or seconds to escape through narrow hatches. Many would not make it. They would drown in darkness, trapped below deck as the ship sank, their screams unheard over the sounds of battle above. For the soldiers on deck, death came in many forms. Javelins hurled from enemy ships could punch through shields and armour. In close combat, gladius swords opened terrible wounds. Men lost limbs, were disemboweled, had their throats cut. The wounded who fell on deck might be trampled by the ongoing fighting. Those who fell overboard with armour on sank immediately, dying in full view of their comrades who could do nothing to help. The survivors faced their own trauma. Men who watched their friends die, who had killed other men face to face, who had seen the ocean turn red with blood. Ancient sources do not discuss post-traumatic stress, but the psychological wounds of Cape Ecnomus must have scarred thousands of men for life. Every survivor would carry memories of that day, of the screaming and the blood and the drowning men, for the rest of their lives. The Roman victory at Cape Ecnomus opened the way to Africa. The fleet sailed on, landing the army at Cape Bon in what is now Tunisia. The invasion of Carthaginian territory had begun. Consul Manlius returned to Rome with the captured ships and prisoners, a triumph that would be celebrated but which could never truly honour the men who had died to achieve it. Consul Regulus remained in Africa with 40 ships and 15,000 infantry to continue the campaign. Initially, the campaign went well. Roman forces won another significant victory at the Battle of Addis and advanced to within sight of Carthage itself. Regulus demanded humiliating surrender terms. Carthage must hand over Sicily, Sardinia and Corsica, pay all of Rome's war expenses, pay annual tribute, and reduce its navy to a single warship while providing 50 warships to Rome on demand. The Carthaginians, facing annihilation, refused these terms and hired a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus to reorganize their army. In 255 BC, Xanthippus crushed Regulus's army, killing thousands of Romans and capturing Regulus himself. The consul who had demanded Carthage's surrender died in Carthaginian captivity, possibly tortured to death, though the details remain disputed by historians. The disaster did not end there. Rome sent a fleet to evacuate the surviving forces from Africa. On the return journey, the fleet was caught in a massive storm off Camarina. The Corvus, that brilliant tactical innovation, proved to be a fatal flaw in heavy seas. The boarding bridges made the ships top-heavy and unstable. In the storm, ship after ship capsized or was driven onto rocks. According to Polybius, 384 warships were lost out of 464, with over 100,000 men drowned. If these numbers are accurate, the storm off Camarina killed more Romans than the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. The victory that had cost 10,000 Roman lives and opened the path to Africa ultimately led to a catastrophic defeat on land and an even more catastrophic loss at sea. The total Roman death toll from the invasion, the defeat at the hands of Xanthippus, and the storm may have exceeded 120,000 men. The Carthaginian losses at Cape Ecnomus, while also severe, were equally staggering when viewed across the entire campaign. The tens of thousands lost in the battle represented a significant portion of Carthage's experienced naval personnel. These were professional sailors and marines, men whose skills took years to develop. Their loss weakened Carthaginian naval power for the remainder of the war. But Carthage survived, rebuilt, and continued fighting for another 14 years until final defeat in 241 BC. The Battle of Cape Ecnomus stands as one of the largest naval battles in human history, possibly the largest ever fought in terms of the number of ships and men involved. 680 warships carrying nearly 300,000 men clashed in a single day of unimaginable violence. The death toll was enormous, with tens of thousands killed or captured. This was ancient warfare at its most brutal. No medical care beyond basic first aid, no rescue operations for drowning men, no distinction between combatants and non-combatants, because every man on a warship was either fighting or rowing. The Mediterranean Sea became a graveyard, and the human cost was almost beyond comprehension. The battle decided nothing. Conclusively, Rome won the day but ultimately lost the campaign. Carthage was defeated but survived to fight on for another decade and a half. The First Punic War would grind on, consuming more lives, more resources, more of both civilizations' strength. And when it finally ended in Roman victory, both sides were exhausted, bled white by 23 years of total war. But Cape Ecnomus remains. It stands as a testament to the scale of human ambition and human violence, to the willingness of ancient states to commit hundreds of thousands of men to battle, and to the horrific cost of those decisions. Every one of those nearly 300,000 men who sailed to Cape Ecnomus was a human being with hopes and fears, with families waiting at home, with lives that mattered. Tens of thousands of them never came home. If this video gave you a new perspective on ancient warfare and the true human cost of these epic battles, consider supporting Wars in History on Patreon. Your support helps us create more in-depth historical content and keeps this channel running. Check out the link in the description. Thank you for watching, and remember to honor those who came before us by learning their stories. See you in the next battle.